Good afternoon. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director of Deutsches Haus at NYU. Welcome to Crisis and Critique, Berlin Theater Today. We are excited to present this conversation among Brendan Wolfe, Olivia Landry, and Sascha Marianne Salzman, moderated by David Safran, which will focus on the recent publications by Brendan Wolfe, Institutional Theatrics, Performing Arts Policy in Post-War Berlin, and Olivia Landry, Theater of Anger, Radical Transnational Performance in Contemporary Berlin. In this conversation, our panelists will confront the changing cultural landscape and role of contemporary theater in Berlin today, and examine how theater operates at the intersection of performance and politics. In other words, what does it mean in our contemporary society to construct political theater? What can Berlin as a case study teach us about how theater and performance contribute to a reimagining of public institutions in times of social crisis? What might the future of German theater look like, and how do changing demographics and publics factor in? On a more personal note, I practically grew up in and with Berlin theater, so I'm really excited to learn more about how things are there now. I have such a life-changing memory, and it was a life-changing experience of seeing Die Hamlet-Maschine in the Heiner Müller production, and I felt that took an impact on my life that I never would have thought possible when I sat down in that theater space. Big thanks go to, of course, our speakers, Brendan, Olivia, Sascha, and David, and a special thanks for the two fabulous books you, Brendan, and Olivia have written, and which, of course, we'll hear more about today. Big thanks also go to my colleagues, Sarah, Christian, Ali, and Zoe, for their great work behind the scenes. Thank you, DAAD, for your kind financial support, and thank you to all the audience members for being here with us today. And please come back for other events. Let me now introduce our moderator, David. David Safran is a distinguished professor of theater and performance and the Vera Maury Roberts Chair in American Theater at CUNY. He holds a PhD in theater arts from Cornell University. His major publications include Taking It Like a Man, White Masculinity, Masochism, and Contemporary American Culture, The Playwright's Voice, American Dramatists on Memory, Writing, and the Politics of Culture, A Queer Sort of Materialism, Recontextualizing American Theater, and Highbrow, Lowdown Theater, Jazz, and the Making of the New Middle Class. There are many more publications he's responsible for, and some of them you can see in the chat where my colleague Sarah is now posting his bio info. And we will also post the bio info for the other speakers in the chat, so you can read it there. We'll also post the links for the books. Which reminds me, you will be able to ask your questions in the Q&A, and the Q&A will be in writing through the Zoom Q&A button on the lower end of your screen. But back to David's bio, which is almost finished. David is also the co-editor of Journal of American Drama and Theater and has served as vice president of the American Society for Theater Research. And I understand he is currently editing a drama review special issue on contemporary German theater, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about this later, and hopefully at some point we can do an in-person event on this, and then I invite everybody to come back to Deutsches Haus in person. That's it for me right now. We're super excited that this has come together and can't wait to hear you all discuss what's going on in Berlin theater today. And please take it away, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a delight and an honor to be here. I'm not exactly sure where here is. I mean, considering we're on 2 different continents, and of course, we're also in actually electronic limbo. But I'm really delighted to be able to moderate this panel. And even though my main work used to be primarily exclusively in US theater, I've, over the past 10, 15 years, have sort of become almost a Germanist. So I have a lot of questions for this wonderful panel. And what I'd like to do is just introduce them. And then I have brief bios. And in fact, I'm not going to be able to post them in the chat because I'm using a different computer. But and then they will just say a few words about their work. So first, we have Olivia Landry, who is assistant professor of German and director of film and documentary studies at Lehigh University. In addition to various articles in the fields of film, theater, gender, and performance studies, she is the author of Movement and Performance in Berlin School Cinema, Theater of Anger, Radical Transnational Performance in Berlin, and A Decolonizing Ear, documentary film disrupts the archive, which is forthcoming. Second, Sasha Mariana Salzman is a novelist, playwright, essayist, and curator. Salzman's theater works have been translated into more than 20 languages and have been awarded, among others, with the Academy of the Arts Art Prize for Theater in 2020. In 2017, their debut novel, Außer sich, Beside Myself, was published. And in autumn 2021, Im Menschen muss alles herrlich sein. Both novels were nominated for the German Book Prize. In 2022, Sasha Mariana Salzman was awarded with the prize of Literaturhäuser for their exceptional oeuvre. And finally, Brandon Wolfe, who is an interdisciplinary theater artist and clinical associate professor at New York University, where he directs the program in dramatic literature. Institutional Theatrics, his book on contemporary performance and cultural policy in Berlin, was published by Northwestern University Press last year. Brandon also co-edited Post-Dramatic Theater and Form and is currently collaborating with playwright-composer Stu on a book about intersecting discourses on race, theater, and rock and roll. Concurrent with this scholarship, Brandon's artistic work explores theater's capacity as social practice. Over the last decade, he co-founded and co-directed 3 public performance ensembles: Culinary Theater, Shakespeare im Park, Berlin, and the UC Movement for Efficient Privatization. So, Olivia, do you want to just say a few words about your work?
Thank you so much, David. And let me just begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here and to be in such great company. So I'll just say a few things about the Theater of Anger. Theater of Anger is essentially a close study of 7 different plays, which premiered between 2006 and 2017. So essentially a decade. And they've been associated with what is called post-migrant theater. And I know we're probably going to talk a little bit more about this term later on, but I'll just say that kind of at its inception, post-migrant theater is considered or was a kind of practice and a response to the very exclusive white ethno-national theater scene in Germany. So essentially, minoritized theater practitioners, actors, artists, directors, and so forth said, well, screw you, we're going to make our own theater. At first, I actually wanted to write a book that was kind of a comprehensive study of post-migrant theater and its antecedents. But I didn't want to write a history or a survey of this movement. I come from literary studies, so I wanted to do some close analysis. I wanted to look closely at a few of these plays. And so I started to look for kind of common qualities. And this is where anger comes in. So in 2017, I started to conceptualize the book and begin writing. And 2017, as many of you know, was a politically very significant year in Germany. In the fall, we have the federal election with the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, gaining a significant number of seats in federal parliament. And the AfD is an extreme right-wing party. And this was for the first time. And then, of course, earlier that year in the US, we have the inauguration of Donald Trump. And then on the other side, we have at the Maxim Gorky Theater in Berlin, the kind of for their third fall salon, the employment and taking up of the concept of Desintegration, which not only pushes back on the imperative of integration and reconciliation, but also, in my opinion, is an importantly and critically angry concept. So anger was really in the air in many different forms, and I think it continues to be. And I was also seeing a lot of anger in these plays. Now, the anger I was seeing was not a chauvinistic anger or an anger informed by resentment, but this was an anger that was directly responding to hate and social injustice through theater and performance. So part of the book is about retracing an affirmative and attributed anger, which I do beginning with Aristotle and going all the way to Black feminist theorists. And then thinking about what this becomes on stage. So I also consider as well the history of theatrical anger and renegotiate it for post-migrant and transnational theater. But I would say the pinnacle of the book is my interview with Sascha Marina Zeitzman, who will speak next. So thank you.
It's such an honor and such a pleasure to listen to you, even being back with you in this conversation. And thank you for the invitation. I think since I'm speaking with such great minds and you guys are theorists and know really more than me coming from within, I'm a theater maker. I don't really, theorize the things we do, but I love to listen to you doing that. And I love to read your books, of course. I think I'll go with being very personal with what I do. I started in Ballhaus Unistraße, where the post-migrant movement came from. When I came to Berlin, there was no such thing as minorities on stage. Maybe you could see one or two tokenized bodies, but we don't need to talk about that. I was studying theater and I was very hungry for the stage. Although all my experiences as a migrant in this country were being offended, not being able to pay the price for a ticket, but I still wanted it. I think that I would have not finished University of Arts, where I was accepted for playwriting, if I would not have landed at a party basically in Ballhaus Unistraße and realized that things could be different. And I think that Olivia is very, very right about the anger in the air. It was also a lot of pot in the air and a lot of love in the air and a lot of music. But basically, and I was far before 2017, the far right really, took a seat in the Bundestag. There was so much unspoken of minor and real-time aggression on minorities. And I could not really make the decision if I want to be a full-time activist or a playwright. And so I landed in this Ballhaus Unistraße kind of sphere where totally different bodies were telling their stories. And for me, that was a dream I heard about, like from the States and other countries far, far away. But I didn't know that I could be a protagonist of my story. That was just like unthinkable. And I know now it sounds like a bit like, oh, poor person, but like it's still the reality in most cities of this country, because I really wanted to remember that Berlin is not Germany, right? I don't know if you think of New York as US or LA as in US. That I can't really tell, but right now I'm sitting in Frankfurt am Main, and Frankfurt's population is over 40% minorities. Over 40% are not what they call bio-German or white German. Do you see that reflected in their art? Zero. I just checked the theater program of the, like the new artistic director. It's horrifying. They still play Goethe. I mean, like that's basically where I come from. But I thought this nightmare is over. So it's not. And yet Berlin is, very straightforward with their political agenda, and that is thanks to Sherman Langhoff, who basically theorized the post-migrant theater, which is not her idea, but she brought it together and she invited the people and found the money so we can work. But it's still a minority position, and it's still something we have to fight very hard for. And also, it's important to remember that in 2017, when the so-called Alternative for Germany, AfD, became part of the government, their very first, request to the Bundestag was to close the Maxim Gorki Theater, where I was working. That's just like, because people tend to think like, your culture, you have to speak about the things, but what is it to you? Well, it's basically existential.
Okay, thank you, Brendan.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Just so grateful to be here. Just wanted quickly to say thank you to Juliana and Zara at Deutsches Haus for all the support in putting this event together, and Sasha, Olivia, and David. I'm such longtime fans and admirers of each of your work in different contexts, so I just feel so lucky to be here and speak with you and also learn from you today. For the next few minutes, I was hoping to give a kind of brief overview of some of the questions and concerns raised in institutional theatrics, right, in the hopes that maybe it could contribute somehow, or even maybe serve as a kind of prehistory to this conversation, since the book more or less ends in 2017, this sort of landmark year. So the central project, I would say, was to explore how various kinds of artistic strategies might be employed to critically engage or maybe even undo entrenched institutional habits, infrastructural frameworks, and organizing principles, and to think about how contemporary performance might also do the urgent work of what we might call in a US context cultural policy, or Kulturpolitik in German. And the book takes up these questions in the context of post-wall Berlin. So beginning right in the early 1990s and continuing, as I said, up until the sort of early, 2012 through 2017 is sort of the end of the book. So as the new German capital redefines itself as a kind of global arts epicenter, amidst what I sort of saw as a kind of steady proliferation over those 30 years of different forms of governmental agendas to dismantle Germany's longstanding tradition of state subsidy in different kinds of ways. So to tell this history, I look at the restructuring of some of Berlin's most central performance venues since the 1990s, like the Schillertheater, the Berliner Ensemble, the Volksbühne, the Hebel am Ufer, as well as the emergence of some of Berlin's more prominent makers and ensembles, many of whom have visited New York in recent years. And what I try to argue in the book is that these varied stages of neoliberal disavowal in the long wake of German reunification also provoked a range of different forms and different kinds of experimental performative practices, both on stage and off stage, that work to forge new kinds of relations between performance and the institutions that house and support it in different kinds of ways. So the different projects I track throughout the book assume radically different forms, but I found myself fascinated over and over again, and especially for somebody coming out of a US context and then moving to Germany for almost a decade, this was still sort of, every time I would re-encounter it, it felt this sort of almost unimaginable in the US, right? But this sort of paradox where theater artists who receive public support in all kinds of different ways end up making use of that support, both to avow the administrations that they're already in, right? But also to work to transform them from inside, right? So artists sort of caught in this amazing position of sort of being dependent on the state in certain kinds of ways and using that state support in order to undermine the state in different kinds of ways. So my hope for the book is that the various forms of institutional imagination that I look at in this post-war period might have implications beyond that historical moment and give us, especially here in the US and in places outside of Germany, new ways to think about politics at the theater. What might it mean, for instance, to make theater politically in addition to making political theater, right? And throughout, I try to suggest that, different aesthetic formations can't be separated, right, from their larger institutional and social context, and that maybe formal experimentation thought of in a more robust way might provide us with different kinds of means, both conceptual, artistic, and practical, for rethinking and reorganizing our institutions of public life. So I'll stop there and very much look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Brandon. Let me just say that in terms of editing the TDR with Matt Cornish, I think we sort of took our mandate as one of trying to explain what is happening in German theater to Anglophone readers, because I am always, repeatedly shocked by how little Anglophones know about German theater, which strikes me as one of the great tragedies of our time. But and so it sort of has become my mission to try to help explain this. And as a result, I find that I'm one of the things that really interests me that is in a sense translation. I don't mean literal translation, but are there equivalences? What are sort of analogous structures? What are analogous ideas, specifically between the U.S. and Germany? So, I'm going to start with a huge question. And I hope you'll just talk. I mean, I don't want to sort of really be in the position of calling on you. So please speak up. When we talk about identity, when we talk about politics and theater in the US, politics usually means some variety of identity politics. But identity politics works very differently in Germany than in the US and proceeds under very different sets of assumptions. How would you characterize what in Germany passes for or substitutes for identity politics?
I can start, or Sasha, do you want to start?
No, I'm dying to hear what you get to say.
No,
Really.
I'm just starting. Maybe if I could just address this, the differences, at least as I see them, and this is probably going to be a major oversimplification, but I feel like when we talk about identity politics in the US, it's not about national identity, or it's rarely a question of national identity. Sometimes it can be. It's not about whether you're American or not. Whereas in Germany, this is pivotal, whether you're German or not. And of course, this is related to a history of immigration, et cetera, and the differences between the two countries. So I wanted to maybe mention that, but I also wanted to go back to what Sasha was saying earlier about this. Essentially, I mean, identity politics are existential, and I think that is so critical. but for so many people, they are. And we've seen the reemergence of identity politics across the board. Of course, since the resurgence also of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has really engaged, among other things, but specifically anti-racist critique. And I think it's very important. And I appreciate this re-embrace and this again taking seriously the importance of identity politics and the necessity for identity politics, which, you know, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I know when I moved to the US to study, people weren't talking about identity politics, and it was kind of a passé thing. So this doesn't quite get us to theater specifically, but I just wanted to say that to maybe get us started.
And that is very precious to me, because you guys know about, you know, both parts of the world, and I'm like, I just can't speak about Europe and East Europe probably, since I was born in Russia. And I think that the current situation in Europe and the war in Ukraine is kind of like important to be part of this conversation, not because it is our political duty to speak about that whenever we can, but also because we discuss identity right now. And that's crazy interesting to me, because European understanding of identity, and specifically German understanding of identity, is coming from a very, very problematic concept. And you know about it because Europeans came to US to commit all these crimes. So basically we are still on the old continent with all our crimes committed. And being a Jewish body in Germany is a very, you know, like a crucial thing. But then the question is, where do you come from as a Jew? If you're a Jew from US, it's a different, you know, like perspective and a different experience. Being a Jew coming from the Soviet Union, it's nonsense, because Germans don't know what you are. They can't read you. They can't really understand the situation because they know nothing about the world I come from, and I understand it only now. But now it's very helpful, because I'm like, so all this misunderstandings come from your lack of knowledge about the continent you live on. Thank you very much. So I think it's important when we speak about identity politics to mention that Germans still have very, very hard time with this term. They tend to think, and by the way, I am in Frankfurt. I'm based in Berlin, but I'm in Frankfurt because I had a discussion on identity politics yesterday, and my dear moderator was really pushing me there, saying that identity politics reproduce exclusion. So it's like, it's that low. You know, like you have to explain everything, which is okay. That's why you go on, you know, like on stage, right? But I'm mentioning the war in Ukraine and that I was born in Russia because what we're discussing now here is what is a Ukrainian and what is a Russian. And again, it's a very existential question, because some people do get visas and some won't, and some people get asylum and some will be invisible forever. Because we have people coming to us from Ukraine who are Palestinians with a Ukrainian passport, of course, all kind of Black European people with Ukrainian passports. We have, you know, all kind of Sinti and Roma community coming to us, but what Germans see are white Christian women. And that's a huge part of our debate here. The Germans are very, very ready to help Christian white women. And this is what they write and say in public. You know, it's not a myth, it's not a conspiracy theory. You can really discuss that, because they say this is like us. We help them because they're like us. Interesting, because so many other people are also coming, and I'm, you know, like I'm part of a huge network helping refugees to come. So I see these people basically daily, and speak to them, and you know, experience what we always experience: how hard it is to find for a Palestinian family a home, and how easy it is to call someone and say, like, so here's, like, you know, this woman from Ukraine, and people assume that she's white. Maybe again, something very personal. My whole family is from Ukraine, but I was born in Russia. My birth certificate says that my nationality is Jewish. This is unreadable for a German audience. So I'm, you know, like I'm a constant irritation, which is very, very productive for theater. That's great stuff. That's just good material. This is what, like, right? All my pieces are basically coming from that. And I think coming from Soviet Union is very helpful. And I don't know if you see a link to US American identity, but like coming from a multinational state really opens your mind for at least something. coming back to what is happening here in theater, theater is the only place in art I know where you really can discuss that, because theater is a place for discussion. Of course, you have paintings and you have all kind of like music where you can, like transform your ideas and discuss your ideas on a different level. But we as a Maxim Gorky theater and post-migrant theater, we always understood theater not only like a stage for art, but art of discussion too. And I think this is why it became so political, and this is why IFD wanted to close us immediately.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say, I mean, this is more of a part joke, right? But, I'm not sure that the American Jewish body is that much more legible in a German context than than other Jewish bodies. I felt pretty illegible for especially, right? I mean, for many years. But, I'm wondering, I mean, maybe this just apropos the sort of art of translation, David, that you were talking about before. I just think it does bear saying that, and maybe this comes as no surprise, but when I was sort of looking at this sort of historical chunk, these 30 years, right? One of the big challenges of thinking through this book, and also what one sort of, it has to be said, in coming to terms with the post-wall theatrical establishment, in the 90s and 2000s, was that it was totally dominated, right? Especially on the state stages in the Staatstheater, but even in the emergence of the free scene, of the independent scene, right, in the late 90s and early 2000s, almost totally dominated by white and most often male artists, right? And so I think it's worth thinking about, right, how, or we have to continue to think about how something we might call a German version of white supremacy pervades, right, the history of the development of the German theater system, as much as we as Americans also sort of revere it and love it, right? And to just sort of throw one other big event, right, into that year 2017, right? And I sort of end the book here, and it's a kind of provocation to myself also for future thinking and hopefully future work, right? But one of the other things that happens as the AfD is getting elected into the Bundestag in 2017 is the Volksbühne gets occupied, right? And one of the sort of weird things that happens in the press, right, or that was happening in the press leading up to that occupation, right, in response to Chris Diakon's appointment as the sort of new artistic head of the Volksbühne, right, is all of a sudden some notion of like what we might call class consciousness gets, good old-fashioned Marxist, maybe white male class consciousness, right? An old version of politics gets sort of juxtaposed up against what one might, using identity politics as a kind of schimpfwort, as a kind of slur, right, against neoliberal identity politics, right? So everyone was throwing around this Steve Bannon quote, where he said, well, if we get the Democrats worrying about identity politics, then we'll sort of kill them on the economy, right? And so you had this weird thing going on in this moment too, where sort of what it might mean to think about radical reorientation or reorganization of social institutions somehow gets opposed to something we might call identity politics. And I think one of the interesting things that happens at that occupation of the Volksbühne is that, at least the way I see it, right, there's this being like, no, like the future of Berlin theater is thinking those two things together, right? What might anti-racist institutionality actually look like in the German theater, right? And what new kinds of artistic forms might these new organizational strategies, right, enable? And so I don't know. Those are some ongoing questions that I continue to have.
Thank you. So many really important, you've just raised so many really important issues, and I have so many follow-up questions. But I wonder, I want to sort of emphasize what Olivia said about the importance of national identity, and that is something that works very, very different in Germany than it does in the United States. But I wonder if perhaps you could say a little bit more about sort of the institutional setup in Germany? Because, I mean, Germany has the largest theater system in the world. I mean, there's something like 130 Staatstheater, and also a rather vibrant Freie Szene. So I wonder if you could just explain a little bit about how this works, and in particular, sort of what the connections are and aren't between the Freie Szene and the Staatstheater.
I'll throw out some numbers I pulled up last night that that I always use to just freak out my students. You know, just to give, you know, when I try to be like, you know, what would it mean to sort of like think of theater as sort of a radical part of public discourse in a different kind of way. And, you know, one way I sort of ask students to think about that is just in terms of resources allocated, right? So if the 2022 National Endowment for the Arts budget for all of America, right, is $201 million, right? The cultural budget, I couldn't find sort of where I had just the theater budget, right? But the cultural budget for Berlin in 2021 is 606 million euros, right? Germany's culture budget being 2.1 billion euros, right? You know, so when I just sort of ask students to think about this, right, you know, like imagine the difference in size, right, and scope. And I just, you know, the other thing I end up telling is, you know, I remember sort of arriving in Berlin for the first time in 2007, and just I couldn't believe, right, that I would like get invited to a friend's house for dinner, like with their parents or something, right, you know, and they would have nothing, they weren't in the culture sector at all, right, you know, and they would just be like, did you see that 6-hour thing that happened at this place that, you know, you've never heard of, right? Or that the Berliner Zeitung, right, you know, every month publishes, right? This is every show that's happening, right? You know, and that like, what would it mean to sort of, as Americans, to sort of imagine that performance or theater might occupy a sort of space in a public conversation that's just unimaginable here, right? You know, for me at the time, you know, Mad Men was running on TV, and I remember there was a certain moment in which, like, every dinner you went to, somebody like, oh, did you see the last episode of Mad Men or something like that? And I remember sort of finding myself in Germany, you know, and that was the case with different directors around town or different houses, or so David, that's just I mean, I'm happy to keep talking about Staatstheater versus Freie Szene, but I just wanted to sort of maybe set up a little bit of the kind of culture shock that I, you know, try to help students understand sometimes when I talk to them about the differences.
Sasha, I mean, do you want to say a little bit about this, since you've worked in, you know, across a number of different arenas, including, of course, being at the Gorky?
Sure. I mean, I love listening to you guys because it's so nice to have that reflected. We are here always complaining about the situation, right? And we got our reasons. But I think, like, for me, especially Berlin is the city shaped by theater and theater makers. And before Sherman Langhoff and Frank Kastorf and all the guys, it always came back to Brecht. Brecht changed the world, not only the theater world, the way we see poetry, the way we actually, even musicals were different after Brecht. And Brecht is very much connected to the Nazi regime. So I think that it is not a coincidence that, you know, like, Germany is founding their theater so well, and the theater is so vivid and so complex and unreadable and troubling for a lot of tourists who come in and don't understand why people shout at them and they're naked. But, like, you know, I love to talk to my students about where we actually come from, starting with Aristotle, of course, but like where we come from in German theater, because they grew up with this, and I think this is normal and this is usual. But I think that we need to speak about history of Germany to be able to understand what's happening on stage. And of course, this Peter Handke, a very problematic Nobel Prize winner, is also part of the very important discussion. So to be very brief, like, I don't have to explain why Brecht changed the world, but what happened after the World War II is that, of course, you know, the denazification never really happened here. It was forced on people, so we had actual Nazis sitting in the audience, and everybody knew about that. And the country where it was even more extreme, a German-speaking country, was Austria, of course. My wife is Austrian, so it's really fun to listen to her complaining about her country. The Germany could not say it was not us. They tried, but it didn't work out. Austrians love to say that Hitler was German, right? Big joke, but somehow it worked for them. So Peter Handke, as an Austrian writer, wrote a piece called Publikumsbeschimpfungen, offending the audience. And it was literally addressing the Nazis, sitting there, sipping their wine afterwards, feeling so good about themselves. And that was also a very important part of, like the 68 movement, the denazification made by the next generation saying no to their fathers and their mothers who were actual Nazis. And I think so that the German history is so much connected, like in their emotional DNA, to everything that happened. That this is the reason why we're so, so special in a way, but also, for very troubling reasons. And we have to know that. Plus, the Germany today is not made of Nazi children. And this is very hard to understand for people who, who still come from a very white perspective and think that they still have to offend the audience. Now we are the audience. We don't want to be offended for crimes we never committed. We're actually, the grandchildren of the other side, and we are the normal kind of like middle class audience. So we need different stuff to see. So there is like a huge battle going on in the public sphere, on stages, in the rooms of artistic directors and people who make decisions, in so-called freie Szene, in the performing scene and the Staatstheater, where we're constantly negotiating who are we talking to. And of course, the majority is still speaking to, like the children of the Nazis. And we are demanding that people talk to us, and we change Germany. Germany look much more like us these days. And still, this is something that we need to negotiate every day.
Olivia, would you like to add something?
Maybe I can just add about the Freie Szene. I think actually Sasha and Brendan know much more about the history of the Freie Szene, but from my understanding, the Freie Szene emerged, of course, in the 60s and 70s as a response to, in part, a very conservative theater institution, right? And also a kind of movement away from the hallowed halls of the big state theaters to the streets, to the lecture halls, where kind of protest became also very theatrical. Already, and this was mostly, of course, in West Germany, but already we see that history of kind of disrupting the theater as an institution in different ways, and kind of growing away from it or moving away from it. Of course, we also see, in the 60s and 70s, a kind of, I don't want to say reconciliation, but a kind of a synthesis of both the state theater and the Freie Szene, which then kind of moving away from state theater also then influenced the state theater. So this comes back to what Brandon was talking about with disavowal in a very important way. But so I think that, as much as we can, I don't want to say praise, but as much as we can kind of, think about the German theater system as so exceptional, certainly in terms of funding and kind of richness, I think that there is a long history of also dissent against this system for important reasons that, I think we all have acknowledged and continue to acknowledge, but I think we need to also kind of remember. So.
Can I just add? Yeah, please, Sasha.
Yes,
no, please, Sasha, please.
Oh, okay. So we both add. Because I was mentioning the Austrian scene and Peter Handke and of course Jelinek, right? Those are Austrian writers that write in German and they changed the German-speaking theater, but they're from Austria because it was so extreme there, because they were so verstaubt, like so old-fashioned that you could just literally shit on the table as a protest, and this is what founded the performance scene in Europe, or especially in like in Central Europe. Pippi Lottie-List is, of course, like one of the most known performers and a video artist, and Beyonce kind of like copied or I don't know, quoted an art by Pippi Lottie-List, and that's huge, like it caused a huge wave. And those people were destroying Austria. They were like, there was this artist with like favorite artist of my wife who literally shit on the table in a big university singing the anthem of Austria. It was that bad. And that shaped the whole performance scene in Germany. But I have to say the performance scene, and this is why I love the free scene in Germany, the free scene in Germany today is very, very international. And by that, I don't mean that they're diverse from Germany, but they're really coming from all kind of places. Mm-hmm. And, like you have all 5 continents involved in this conversation, which makes it more interesting and more rich and not so much connected to this, dark German history.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'll just also for a little bit more context, right? When one thinks about the Staatstheater or the state theater, right? You think about these sort of large institutions, with these sort of couple of key facets, right? There's an ensemble, a group of actors, performers, designers, directors, right, who are sort of permanently employed in these places, right? As state employees with a kind of tenure, with a kind of Verbeamtung, right? And on the one hand, when I tell this to American students, they're like, want to be actors. They just can't believe it. Like, what? I could have like health insurance and like a lifetime job, right? And then, of course, to sort of allude to what both Sasha and Olivia were saying, right, there's this sort of march through the institutions and real skepticism post 68 of the sort of verstaubte, sort of old, highly bureaucratic, highly top down, totally bloated, highly inefficient, highly unfree, you might say, right, sort of state apparatus, right, and this real desire to sort of bust out of it, right? And of course, the dark side of that history that we now know is, right, like that's what leads to precarity, right? In another kind of way, right? But you do have, especially in West Germany and then in sort of post-reunification Germany, this sort of emergence of what one might call a freie Szene or an independent scene aesthetic, right? That is, many of those people are coming out of a couple of different university settings, quite famously the Gießen Institute for Angewandte Theaterwissenschaft, Applied Theater Studies, and now Hildesheim has sort of tried to recreate that model as a way of also really asking people to sort of rethink both the sort of aesthetics of the state theater, namely the repertoire, but also its organizational models. So groups like Gob Squad and Rimini Protocol and Shishi Pop that emerge in the 1990s, right, and so many others, right, are thinking about alternative institutional models, right, how to organize a career in the theater if one wants a kind of freedom, right, to make the kind of work that one wants to make without living in precarity, right, and what might that, how does the free scene sort of both enable but also constrain this sort of critique of the large, bloated institution?
Maybe I can just add, if that's not too much.
Yes, please.
Just a little anecdote about what Brennan was saying is exactly like that was basically my life the last years, because like I was the artistic director of a small stage. The Maxim Gorky Theater has 2 stages, the big stage and the small stage, and I was the head of the small stage studio. Yeah, the Russian letter, the Cyrillic letter, and I was like so against the state. We were part of the state theater, but I was like, yeah, let's destroy this. Let's play with this. And a very important colleague who really, like, a different generation who saw more than me, he was like, Sasha, I said that in the 90s and the wrong people were applauding. And I was like, oh shit. I just didn't think of the neoliberal takeover and what it means to have no state. And actually, like, I could not be more pro-state. The question is who is sitting in the important chairs, in the cozy chairs. And this is what we need to work on. We don't need to destroy the state. We need to put the right people in charge.
It seems to me that one change that is happening, demonstrable change, is higher profile for a lot of women directors and theater makers. I know for the past few years, the Theatertreffen has sort of, that's been part of their mission in terms of bringing more women directors in. And I'm curious, how significant a change do you see this? I mean, all I can say is in the past 10 years, I've seen, a huge increase in the number of sort of high profile women directors. And I'm sort of curious how you see it.
Come on, Olivia, say something, please.
It's I feel like, especially with COVID and the last few years, I really haven't been, well, I don't want to say there hasn't been a strong theater scene in Berlin, but I haven't really been exposed to it. So I feel like beyond what I can, find online, or just kind of glean from speaking to people, I'm kind of out of touch with what's going on in the last few years. But just looking through it, as I think Brandon and Sasha both mentioned, I was looking through at some of the theaters, some of my kind of old haunts, and to see what was going on. And I would say I notice, I noticed this trend that there seemed to be. And what that means, I can't say, but it seemed to be certainly more, directors with kind of female names, people I'm not familiar with, so I can't speak to how they identify. But so that is something that I've come across. But in terms of administratively, I don't know that I see a big difference. And I'm maybe this is yet to come. One can only hope.
It'll be interesting to see who takes over now that Franziska Werner and Joy Kalu are leaving the Sophienseele, what's going to happen with the Sophienseele in Berlin. Of course, women intendanten like Julia Wissert, and is it Düsseldorf where she is now?
Dortmund.
In Dortmund, yeah. But I've been very excited about, not that this is representative in any way, right? But Claudia Bauer, Susanna Kennedy in a sort of different range. But I had the opportunity that we invited Maria Schleef to come sort of talk at NYU, and the last few years, just also thinking about Sasha's comment about Viennese shitting on the table. Florentina Holzinger come and sort of lead some master classes also for students in, I can speak more to Marie and Florentina's work just in the sense of sort of radical feminist reevaluations of what it might mean to rethink the canon. I was just so impressed. Marie came in and she was like, sure, I could do Faust. But like, what if I did that? Like, what if anytime I get invited into a Staatstheater, I ask them to sort of radically blow up the repertoire in some kind of way, right? Text only written by women, right? What might that sort of highly polemical position mean, right? How might that institute new kinds of organizational changes, right? That then will demand new kinds of aesthetics, right? And also bring in different kinds of audience. And, it seems to me that Florentina is doing something quite similar, right? Really asking us to sort of look at the history of dance and radically reevaluate it, right? Along different lines, right? Working with different communities of performers that are radically not Staatstheater performers, right? People from stunt work, people from the circus, people from, different, BDSM communities, right? It seems to me that this is now that these directors are being invited into the big houses, right, out of the Freie Szene, right? Marie Schleef from this 6-hour piece with Anna Tisma at Bauhaus Ost, then to now she's getting, was invited to Theatertreffen and now is getting invitations all in state theaters all over Germany, right? This is gonna, hopefully in the next few years, lead to some really exciting and radical shifts. My hope.
One really important difference, I think, between German theater and US theater, or British theater for that matter, is the fact that German theater is not centralized the way in Berlin. I mean, yeah, Berlin has a larger scene, but it's also the largest city. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you think makes Berlin theater unique in Germany.
Well, if I may jump in, it's the division of the country. I mean, you have the East and the West in the same city, and that is very special. And you have to imagine that, like, basically, I'm working in the East with the Maxim Gorky Theater, and then you have the Volksbühne, which literally looks like Stalin's hometown. It's very terrifying to stand in front of this building. Like, like Germans think it's actually funny, but I'm seeing, genocide. And that is just what Berlin is. No matter where you look, you see a genocide, you see bombs, and you see history. And that is what is so special about Berlin. You cannot erase that from the city. If you do that, there will be nothing left. And plus, and we will for sure come to the question about theater engagement in, like helping Ukrainian refugees. I saw it in the one of the questions, how theaters react to the current situation, but just like to give you an idea of how the city reacts to the situation, we have the Checkpoint Charlie, the famous Checkpoint Charlie, where there's poor actors, I think very precarious living human beings, had to dress up like, Soviet soldiers and to stand there like this for tourists. And there was like this huge red flag, like the communist flag. And every time I would bike there, like it would make me want to puke, right? Like, I don't think it's funny. I don't think like people should romanticize what happened there. And I was very curious to see how they're going to change the, like the look of this part of the city now. Now we're finally starting to question how glorious it was, what happened there. And they put a huge Ukrainian flag on top of the red flag. So it's like, it's like this, the history is being like, the history doesn't stop being written and rewritten on the walls of the city. And I think that is an example for what is actually happening on stage. You always will have the Goethe. You always will do Faust. Of course you would do Faust. Why not? I mean, like the first part is actually quite well written. And there can be a feminist version of that. There can be. Or it doesn't have to be, because some people need to see, like the actual one, whatever, which is really not feminist. But then you have like people who would put layers and layers on top of what is actually happening, not only on stage, but also, like in the foyer, in the dressing room, in the bathrooms. Like when we took over, just an example, Maxim Gorky Theater, built by Soviets. Like, it's insane that I was working in Maxim Gorky Theater, built by Soviets, looks like, like a Soviet cream cake, called after a Russian playwright, is very close to Berliner Ensemble and the Volksbühne, which is like a crazy mixture. And so when we took over, I was like, okay, so we have bathrooms for men and women, and where am I supposed to go, right? And all my friends. So, like the only thing I did for queer people, I just took the signs down, because we didn't have the money to build toilets for, like non-binary and trans people. So I said like, okay, so like it's all gender. It's very easy actually to do. I just took this signs down, and the press started to write about me as if I destroyed the history of this whole place. And, like there was a huge campaign, but the only thing we did is actually to put plants in the pissoirs, right? And I think that it is important that the plants in the pissoirs of Maxim Gorky Theater is still the building that the Soviets built. And for me, it was always very essential that theater is not only what's happening on stage behind the curtain, so that when the curtain opens, but every step you make towards the theater, including how much a ticket costs, is theater. And that is, like so many different ages exist at the same time in Berlin.
If I could just add, I mean, it's certainly not unique to Berlin, but the large Turkish German community in Berlin, beginning in the early 60s and until the early 70s with the bilateral labor migration between Turkey and Germany, and how just the very fact that many Turkish laborers settled in and around West Berlin and make up a large percentage of the population. And this is, I mean, I don't want to speak of one particular community, but certainly a population that is active politically and in terms of activism and artistically. So I think that's also a very important component, certainly, of Berlin, not only contemporary Berlin, but Berlin of the last kind of, half a century almost. So that I think also plays into the contemporary theater scene in an important way.
If I could just add just one other thought I have, it seems too, right, that it was a high priority post-unification or reunification, right, on the part of the Grand Coalition, right, the CDU and the SPD came together, right? It seemed like it was a huge priority to turn Berlin into this sort of global metropolis, right? And that, from a sort of, there was a large cultural political agenda to make Berlin a kind of global city, right? And it seems like that's also been a really productive, how would you say, Gegenwind, like, a sort of space against which to react for a lot of theater makers as well, right? So on the one hand, one's reaping the benefit from the sort of like highly robust Hauptstadt Kulturfonds, right? On the one hand, right, which sort of funds all of this work. And on the other hand, to sort of talk again, right, about what Sasha was saying before, this sort of paradoxical position of like having the great privilege of having access to funding, right? Because Berlin is doing a really great job selling itself as first aber sexy, right? And now, under Michael Müller, like unapologetic captain of creative industry, right? Which is why the Chris Durkin thing was so heated in a certain way, right? But also this amazing tradition of a kind of countercultural scene, right? That like continues, I think, to still have a ton of creative juice as a way of sort of working against the state, right? And this sort of other narrative of sort of unencumbered neoliberal progress, right? And so that Berlin is this place that sort of has to wrestle with these contradictions, and that becomes a really productive place for makers to make work.
Well, maybe that is a possible time to answer one of the questions, because there was a question towards the, like the DACON situation and what happened there, and I'm sure that you guys can be more precise about the actual events. I was in the middle of the thing, so I can't really tell you what happened after what, but like there was war in Berlin, and I love Berlin for it, because it showed how much the city cares about theater and how much it's part of this identity. So what basically happened, I guess everybody knows, but just like to say that it was, for me personally, very important that Frank Castorf was finally fired from his job. He violated nearly every rule and every basic commitment on, like humanity. And I never really understood why he could, continue doing that. But I guess I'm not sure if that's a fair comparison, but we had the same questions with Harvey Weinstein, etc. So like, he was basically our theater Harvey Weinstein. And it was public that he had children with the half of his crew. I mean, this is a fact you cannot really deny. And the pieces he was directing were considered being like genius. And I think I just missed that part. I think in the 90s, he really changed a lot for the city, and the city is very thankful for, like being shaped by, like such a important kind of like view on theater, which Frank Castorf developed with his crew. But when I came to Berlin 2008, it was basically only the Madame Tussauds version of it. You would see, like naked women on stage, screaming all the time Russian things, because he would basically stage only Russian writers. By the way, most of them were very, very problematic, or still, like Limonov, who is like a neo-fascist. Thank God he died. And it was also okay for Frank Castorf to take pictures in his office, where he would have a huge painting of Joseph Stalin That's not a joke. You can look it up. He had a picture of Stalin. He loved to take pictures with this picture, and that was okay by then. So when he was fired, I was like, okay, progress. And then Chris Dercon came, and I was like, failure. This is what my colleagues talk about when they say like neoliberal takeover. This guy doesn't care about theater. And I don't need to go into this, like we're close to the end, but like that was like two opponents of the evil, the like the Stalinist and the neoliberalist. And people really cared about this. And that was the beauty of Berlin. Like it was not the fight and also, like the quad in the Volksbühne. It was not only theater people, and it was not only in this part of town. The whole town was burning. And I love Berlin for it, but then when it was announced that René Polish will take over, and I love René, I love his work. I think my whole thinking about stage was shaped by him. That was my enlightenment, like maybe a bit close to what Brennan and Olivia described with their like, aha, this is German theater. It changed my life, seeing what he's done back then. But there is apparently a point in a life of an artist where you become your own interpreter, your own Madame Tussauds, kind of your museum. And this is where we are now. And that is very, very sad because most of them are not only colleagues, but friends of mine in the Volksbühne. But what's happening now is, and this is also, to be fair, partly pandemic. Volksbühne is not making any progress, any changes, any development in any direction. It's a very wide place for people who used to like René Polish pieces in 2010. So we're still, waiting for René Polish awakening and revolution, but I would always give him, another shot because he really changed a lot in a very, very good direction.
Yeah, I really want to underscore, Sasha, what you said. I mean, I've been incredibly, I'm not sure that I was really expecting a great deal of change when Polish took over, but I've been pretty appalled this season at what I've seen, and surprised because I know he's smarter than that, but I don't know what's going on there. But I wonder if there are any questions from listeners. If you have any, do put them in the chat. In the meantime, I wonder if...
Actually, David, this is Juliana. There are questions, but they're not in the chat. They're in the Q&A. If you look at the Q&A button, you'll find them. Sorry to come out of the blue here.
Thank you. I was, yes. All right.
So there's a question about how theater is currently responding to the war in Ukraine, and I think I partly answered that one. I just wanted to add maybe that nearly every theater is adding programs to invite and host Ukrainian writers and artists and pay them. And when shit hit the fan in the 24th of February, theaters were the first one to react, and I think that's not a coincidence. Because theater always means action, and they knew what they were doing. That was very beautiful to watch.
Yeah, I too was really struck by that this season, and it's very, very powerful. And whenever I go to the Deutsches Theater and sort of pass right by it's about 100 meters from the Ukrainian embassy, and I just, oh my God, it's really pretty overwhelming. But yes, I really been impressed with the way that theaters have addressed that. And just the fact that it's so much more present in Germany than it is here, where it seems a million miles away. There's a question about the pandemic and how that has impacted the German theater scene. Any thoughts about this?
I mean, just very briefly, I did appreciate that, at least for someone away from Berlin, away from Germany, that I was able to, a lot of theater was streamed, which I thought was very nice. And also you could, I know, for example, with the Gorky, you could pay you could kind of almost choose how much you wanted to pay, from maybe €5 up to €20. And I thought that that was a really nice inclusive measure, which I certainly appreciated as someone away from Berlin, that one could still participate in theater. Of course, theater is, because it's such an important place for discussion, something that, of course, Sasha mentioned at the beginning, and you don't have that discussion online. It wasn't the same, but it was nonetheless, I felt, a very nice, inclusive gesture that a lot of theaters in Germany participated in. So, and I feel like that is still part of the repertoire to some degree, that a lot of productions are still being streamed, which is kind of interesting. And I'm not sure if that's going to continue, but I feel like that it certainly has changed the kind of format of theater in an important way, at least temporarily. So.
Yeah, that too, I'd like to underscore. I mean, the theaters, especially the first year into the pandemic, broadcast hundreds and hundreds of videos, a number of them live performances, many of them, probably most of them, archival performances. And I have to say, as a theater historian, I feel that, this has completely changed the kind of work, actually, that we can do, just having access to this work now.
It was the first time I was ever able to really teach. I mean, talk about like helping non-Germans, like find their way into a world of German theater, right? Like this is another aspect, right, of the sort of Staatstheater sort of, and the robust funding, right, that like the just incessant need to archive everything, right, means that there is this archive to be broadcast, right, and that like what an amazing opportunity to be able to sort of invite people to sort of view this work fully subtitled, right, and know that somebody, hopefully somebody was paid to do that, right, do that work. But on the other hand, right, I certainly, and this makes me maybe sound like a Luddite, right, but it also comes with just being totally depleted and depressed, right, that like so much, there's a reason that like every Staatstheater also has a bar built into it, right, that like, or a cantina, right, and you get to like go be with people and like, have a big fight and try and figure out like what the hell you just saw and what it was about and what you want to do, and then maybe you want to go see it again, right? And that like this becoming this sort of any opportunity to sort of turn us into more digital sort of isolated digital monads, right, is also quite worrisome for me, right, in a moment where what's to become, right, what's to become of our field and this work. I don't know.
Well, in answer to that, Brandon, I've been really fascinated to observe the difference between New York theater and German theater post, I'm not even sure we can say post-pandemic, but since March 2020. And one thing that I notice whenever I go to the theater in Germany is the renewed sense of excitement and a kind of joy of being present, and the fact that we're all sharing this together, and a kind of, I would almost say, a kind of renewed directness of communication. The fact that in German theater, the people on stage are really talking to the people in the audience. It's not just sort of an imaginary audience; they're real people. And I've been sort of again overwhelmed by that the past year, and that's not been the case here. from what I've observed. In fact, I feel almost the opposite, that there's a sense of caution on the part of performers, a kind of almost unwillingness to, or a reluctance to put themselves out there, which, well, I mean, for me, it's a very striking difference, and unfortunately underlines a lot of what I see as sort of fundamental differences between how theater works in Germany and how it works here.
Can I add something that I'm not sure if you have this if the same experience or similar experiences or observations on what's happening in the US, but Brandon, I was thinking about what like your feeling of like, yeah, where's the canteen, where's the bar where we can fight? So what happened with the pandemic also was that since people were going nuts globally, and of course also in Germany, and of course especially people who are used to go on stage every day, it's like rehearsal room or stage from morning till night, and it's important, it's existential, it's like the only thing you know, and you're forbidden to do that. People start to reflect on the institution, and people started to criticize the institution, and that was a great thing.
Yeah.
Like, it was hard, it's still hard. It's a very painful conversation, including the Maxim Gorky Theater facing a huge scandal. I don't know if scandal is the right word, but like we needed to reflect on violence happening within the structure.
Yeah.
And that happened to a lot of theaters, and that would not have happened if the actors and actresses would not have the time,
Yeah.
you know, like just to sit down and think and ask themselves what's going on.
Yeah.
Because if you like, you know, running like this rat and have to go on stage every night, you just let a lot of things happen to you. And suddenly they had time, and they realized a lot of things should be done different. And I think part of the excitement David is reflecting on is also that. Like, I'm not only responsible, it's my action. It's like, you know, it's my pleasure to create with you, and understanding theater as a part of creation, not only, you know, the acting, but the whole thing is like a social, you know, piece of art. And since it worked and a lot of people had to go because, you know, of violent behavior, you know, people feel encouraged and empowered to be part of this creation.
Sasha, can I just ask a follow-up? I mean, it's so inspiring what you're saying, right? Like that also, this forced pause is also a moment of kind of, you know, an opportunity for institutional critique in a kind of way. And what are some of the, I mean, if you can share, you know, like what are some of the changes that you see, or you know, that you think or hope might be lasting ones in terms of the working lives of artists, but also of the sort of priorities of the institutions that you know that you have access to?
There are a lot. I try to be as brief and concrete as I can. Contract. For example, in the contract of like a common, normal, standard contract of an actor in Germany, there would be like this line where you're obliged to be, I don't know, 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers close to the theater, just in case someone gets sick and you have to jump in on the same night.
Yeah.
Like, this is military. I'm sorry. Who else is supposed to dedicate their life so deeply? And they did it with pleasure. But at one point they were like, actually, we don't need to do that anymore. You can find another solution. We need to have a life to be good artists. Including rehearsal times. A lot of theater are not rehearsing on Saturdays anymore, which is, you can question it, but like this thing of like, we're gonna die here together out of tiredness, because you know, like we rehearse till 2 a.m, but at 10 o'clock on the next day you have to be sharp and precise. Great. And so we have a gentle reminder that might be, did you see that in the chat, right? Okay. I think we are close to the end and I'm talking too much. Okay, so just to be even shorter, I like the changes are very concrete, and they're more according to the paperwork than the artistic outcome. Which is the structure that is changing, and that is the thing we need, right?
Yeah, I guess we are sort of nearing the end. And are there sort of concluding remarks or actually more reflections on what we've been talking about today further? I mean, Olivia, have you?
It's tricky to kind of wrap things up. I feel like we raised a lot of important issues, but there's still so much that we could discuss and address. I mean, maybe something just kind of about the future. We talked a little bit about the present and possibly, you know, kind of post-COVID, what that looks like, but just in terms of the future and in terms of what it could mean in the future to make political theater, as that was something that was kind of one of the points that Juliana raised at the beginning. What does it mean today, but also what will it mean in the future to make political theater? And something I learned from Sasha, this kind of certainly the importance of Brecht, not the kind of not the dogmatic Brecht, but the Brecht that encourages reflection and confrontation, but also the kind of you know, thinking that a little bit further, this kind of readiness for action that the theater can and ought to instill. So I mean, this is my hope. I think that theater is a really a critical space for politics, and I hope that it remains as such.
Brandon, is there anything you'd like to close with?
You know, I mean, I guess I would say, you know, I also shared some of the ambivalences that Sasha was talking about the Volksbühne, right? And you know, since for me that was an institution that just was so provocative in so many ways when I arrived in Berlin for the first time, and you know, the end of the Diakon moment seemed like a real, you know, and seemed like a real opportunity for that to be a space in which one really started to think about, you know, what might radical feminist, queer, and anti-racist reorientations and reorganizations, how might those reorientations serve as opportunities for us to sort of rethink the state apparatus, but also rethink the state theater apparatus, both organizationally and aesthetically. And so I'm, you know, my open question, right, is to, you know, and hopeful question is that is still something that we'll get to witness and be a part of.
Okay, Sasha, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I feel we have so many great questions from the audience. I want to thank them for the great questions and apologize that we didn't really come to all of, you know, like the fields you were wondering about. I also find them very interesting. Would love to hear, you know, Brandon and Olivia elaborating on this. So I hope like next time we just meet in person, and it's going to be like a 6 hours event everybody will speak about later on, right?
Let's do it. Let's do it. Fight at the bar.
All right.
When we're allowed to
Cool.
convene.
See you there.
Exactly.
Well, let me thank you all so much for engaging in the art of discussion, and I'm quoting Sasha here from earlier in the conversation. It was wonderful to listen to you and to find out more about what's going on, what should be going on, what has been going on, and the reasons for all of the above. And let's hope that the German theaters will continue, or at least some of them will continue to implement political agendas and practical agendas in response to current crises, not just the Ukraine crisis, but other refugee crises. And there are a lot and too many crises really to address. But if we can all address some of them, that will help a little bit. And if you want to hear more from Brendan about his book, NYU Skirball is doing a conversation tomorrow, I think at 4. Is that right, Brendan?
It's a day-long sort of symposium on sort of infrastructures and aesthetics, right? That begins at 2 Eastern time, and then there'll be one panel about sort of different historical and and national context, thinking about sort of policy and performance, and then a New York artist panel, and then there'll be a sort of conversation about the book, from 4 to 5.
Great. And I think Sasha has just posted the link in the chat, so you can all just click on that, and then you see the entire Scribble program that I think originally was supposed to happen in person, but it's now happening on Zoom. So even people who just joined here from Germany or other countries can join tomorrow. And before we wrap things up, I just want to give a quick shout out to our last program this semester, which will be several screenings and conversation about the German playwright and author and director and poet Thomas Brasch, who passed away way too early. And we'll do that later in May and in June with a bunch of New York-based arts organization. And I think Zaha is also dropping the link for that in the chat. So check that out. Some things are in person, some things are on Zoom, and hopefully later this year we'll be able to do many more things, present many more events in person, but we'll of course also continue to do things virtually as it makes most sense. But thank you all for participating in this conversation, for asking great questions, for writing wonderful books, and for doing great work in art and life. Thank you so much.
Thank
care.
you.
Thank
you
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 so
soon.
much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you so
Take care,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.